Dámy a pánové, za malou chvíli začneme, prosím posaďte se, kdo může. Dobré odpoledne všem. Dovolte mi, abych se představil, mé jméno je Josef Šíma, jsem rektorem Vysoké školy Cevro Institut, v jejichž prostorách se nacházíte. A jak vy sami dobře víte, dnes jsme se tu setkali proto, abychom oslavili nový společný počin Liberálního institutu a Vysoké školy Cevro Institut, vydání knihy pana profesora Richarda Epsteina Právo, ekonomie a politika. Toto vše v rámci již dlouhé série tzv. Pražských jarních přednášek a toto vše především díky našim sponzorům, kterými jsou skupina ČES a nadace Friedricha Naumanna. Já bych na úvod požádal projektovou manažerku Liberálního institutu Denisu Šustrovou, aby vás seznámila s historií projektu Pražská jarní přednáška.
Dámy a pánové, já vás ráda tady vítám na jedné z našich dalších pražských jarních přednášek a krátce bych vám něco o nich řekla. Kromě toho, že Liberální institut se zabývá několika aktivitami, jako je například pořádání přednášek, letní univerzitou, letní školou, vydávání knih nebo například Den daňové svobody, tak mezi nimi patří i jarní přednášky. Trošku retrospektivy do toho, co jsme z jarních přednášek měli. Jestli mi bude fungovat. První jarní přednáška Liberálního institutu byla v roce 2001, na které vystoupil, jak vidíme na fotce, Lord Ralph Harris, který představil české vydání knihy Adama Smitha Pojednání o podstatě a původu na bohatství národu. Ralph Harris je lord a člen horní sněmovny jejího veličenstva a ředitel Institute of Affairs v Londýně. Dále vystoupil Jan Pavlík, spoluzakladatel Liberálního institutu a vedoucí katedry filozofie Vysoké školy ekonomické, a také František Vencovský, profesor ekonomie. Tak snad to budu mít po pořadě. Tak, další vystoupení bylo v roce 2004 Zásady hospodářského řádu od Waltera Eukena, které představil Otmar Issing, což je člen správní rady Evropské centrální banky, a vystoupil s přednáškou o primátu cenové stability. Další z jarních přednášek byla od Antonio de Jessey, což je známý francouzský liberální ekonom, s přednáškou Jak je správná sociální spravedlnost, a uvedl český překlad knihy od Adama Smitha Teorie mravních citů. Můžete ho vidět na fotografii spolu s docentem Schwarzem. Další jarní přednáška byla o lidském jednání. Vystoupil na ní prezident Václav Klaus se slavnostním představením a poté následovala přednáška o Human Action od Rona Paula, což je člen Kongresu Spojených států amerických. Na fotce můžeme vidět z vaší levé strany Rona Paula, pana profesora Šímu, Luďka Sekiru, což byl partnerem k vydání právě téhleté knihy, pan prezident Václav Klaus a Miroslav Ševčík, ředitel Liberálního institutu. Další přednáška se týkala knihy Právo a svoboda od Bruna Leony, kterou představil Enrico Colombato, profesor z Università de Torino. Dále vystoupil Dušan Henrich z Cevro institutu a Ivan Langer jako ministr vnitra České republiky. Následovala další přednáška, rok poté, v roce 2008, uvedl Jacques Garelot, což je další ze slavných francouzských liberálních ekonomů, knihu Vzestup a pád národů od pana Olsona. V loňském roce v Cevro institutu proběhla přednáška Etika svobody, která měla stejný název jako vydávaná kniha od Rothbarda. Předvedl ji Hans Hermann Hoppe, který zároveň napsal k téhleté knize předmluvu. Dále zároveň byla vydána kniha Demokracie, anarchie a omyly ekonomie od stejného vystupujícího. A teď se nacházíme na další z pražských jarních přednášek, na které vystoupí pan profesor Epstein a pan Šíma. A její téma je právo v rukou politiků, tak doufejme, že politici budou mít v rukou nejenom právo, ale i své myšlenky a svůj mozek. Děkuju.
Děkuji Denise za představení minulosti pražské jarní přednášky, ale nyní již k dnešku. Kniha Právo, ekonomie a politika není mimořádná jen kvůli svému obsahu a mimořádné osobnosti jejího autora, ale také pro svou důležitost pro vysokou školu Cevro institut, v jejím čele stojí. Zahajuje totiž z brusu novou řadu odborných publikací, knih věhlasných zahraničních autorů a profesorů této školy Cevro Institute Academic Press, kterou chce tato vysoká škola ukázat světu, že je sice mladou, ale zároveň plnohodnotnou, flexibilní a inovativní vzdělávací institucí, která nejen vyučuje, vytváří díky těmto krásným prostorám a malým studijním skupinám rodinnou atmosféru, a tedy pohodu pro své studenty, ale produkuje i vědecká díla. Pořádá mezinárodní vědecké konference, viz zítra začínající Pražská konference o politické ekonomii, hostí významné zahraniční profesory, zkrátka je školou osobností a je na ní rady studovat. Vysoká škola Cevro institut se zároveň snaží nabízet studijní obory, které budou průřezové. Na pomezí disciplín, neboť věříme, že pro pochopení dění ve společnosti je nutné bořit hranice existujících oborů. A právě zde je nám dílo profesora Epsteina velkým vzorem. Právo, okořeněné ekonomií a aplikací do oblasti hospodářské politiky, je něco, co bychom byli rádi, aby naši studenti ovládali. Vzdělání nemá být totiž samoučelné. Je to něco, co bychom byli rádi, samoučelné. Má produkovat poznatky, které budou ovlivňovat veřejné debaty. A vysoká škola Cevro institut má ve svém poslání připravovat studenty na působení ve veřejném životě. Nechceme pěstovat hyperspecializaci, ale chápání v souvislostech napříč disciplínami. Obdobně jako se stará dobrá smyslovská ekonomie ve 20. století rozpadla do nesouvisejících dílčích disciplín, i z práva vymizelo staré metaprávo a často zůstala jen víceméně náhodná ad hoc rozhodnutí a společné techniky. Kromě toho se tyto dvě disciplíny, ekonomie a právo, když se po dlouhou dobu vyvíjely společně, shodou několika osobností oddělili a právníci se přestali s ekonomy bavit. A samozřejmě naopak. V naší kontinentální tradici to bylo a je něco bezprecedentního. Vždyť například největší rakouští ekonomové byli samozřejmě zároveň také právníci. Profesor Richard Epstein je jedním z velkých myslitelů sklonku 20. století kteří se zasloužili o opětovné propojování obou těchto disciplín při současném rozpracovávání principů politické filozofie. Aby si totiž obě disciplíny zachovaly svou relevanci a nebyly pouhým akademickým cvičením, potřebují jedna druhou. Aktivistický čistý právník je totiž pro společnost stejně nebezpečný jako aktivistický čistý ekonom. A jsou-li oba bez hlubšího zakořenění v politické filozofii, je katastrofa na spadnutí. Věřím proto, že návštěva profesora Richarda Epsteina v Praze a publikování jeho knihy přispěje i zde k rozvinutí kultivovanější diskuze o povaze práva, dopadech legislativních opatření, logice fungování politiky, podstatě státní moci a fungování trhu. Liberálnímu institutu a partnerům této akce patří proto velký dík za zajištění návštěvy našeho vzácného hosta. Dovolte mi nyní, abych vám profesora Epsteina krátce a v angličtině představil. Allow me now to introduce you briefly and in English Professor Richard Epstein's achievements. Richard Epstein is the James Parker Hall Distinguished Service Professor of Law, the Director of the Law and Economics Program at the University of Chicago Law School. He is also the Peter and Kirsten Bedford Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution. Since 2007, he has been a visiting professor of law at New York University and will be joining as a permanent faculty member. Richard Epstein is considered one of the most influential legal thinkers of modern times. Richard Epstein graduated from Columbia University in 1964. He received a BA in jurisprudence from Oxford in 1966. He graduated from Yale Law School with an LLB in 1968. He began his teaching career at the University of Southern California Law School. Richard Epstein is a unique mix of a legal theorist, an economist, and political philosopher. A very rare mix indeed. His cross-boundary expertise and his classical liberal or libertarian views made him a very special animal. Professor Epstein is an enormously productive author, publishing at a pace of one book each year, together with hundreds of both academic and popular articles. Among his most widely read books we can find Simple Rules for the Complex World, in which he argues that the more complex social reality, which many consider to be a reason for more legal regulation, is a reason for the exact opposite, a set of simple, understandable rules that would produce social harmony rather than costly, permanent conflicts. In 2009, he published a book called The Case Against the Employee Free Choice Act with the Hoover Institution Press. In 2006, How Progressives Rewrote the Constitution, published by the Cato Institute. The same year, Overdose, How Excessive Government Regulation Stifles Pharmaceutical Innovation, published by the Yale University Press. In 2003, Skepticism and Freedom, A Modern Case for Classical Liberalism, published by the University of Chicago Press. 1992, Forbidden Grounds, The Case Against Employment Discrimination Laws, published by Harvard University Press. In 1985, the famous book Takings, Private Property and the Power of Eminent Domain, published by the Harvard University Press, etc., etc. It is my great pleasure to have a chance to give now the floor to Professor Epstein, especially today, on the occasion of the first ever translation of his text into Czech. Please join me in welcoming the one and only Richard Epstein.
It's a very great honor for me to be here. I shall try to speak diligently for the translator, but looking around, I don't see a single set of persons wearing the earphones. Now they're coming on. And so I will try to speak a little bit slowly. And I'd like to thank all the distinguished guests from journalism, banking, the professions, and law who come. I'd like to give a special thanks to the students who are sitting around quite literally in the gallery, many of whom have heard me speak 3 or 4 times already, and I regard this as a tribute to their endurance, not necessarily to their judgment, to come and listen to me yet another time. And the title of my talk, I'm told, if I remember correctly, is Law in the Hands of Politicians. And Joseph sort of hinted at me, he might want me to talk about the Obama administration, but I decided that would be the last part of the talk. I think it's actually much more important on an occasion like this to give some sense of the historical sweep of the way in which law works when it's in the hands of the politicians. And I'm going to do it with reference to American politics, not with reference to the local situations in the Czech Republic. I'm going to do it at a fairly high level of generality, covering close to 100 years in 45 minutes, which essentially gives me about 2 minutes per year. Now, you're going to have to forgive, therefore, that little bit of superficiality. Now, to do this at that level, what you have to understand is that the only way you can understand the sweep of politics in this regard is to sort of reduce it to a fundamental kind of conflict. And the conflict that I have been increasingly more occupied with in the last 5 to 10 years is one which in fact is now playing itself out quite dramatically in the American context, but its roots go back certainly to about the period around 1912 when Woodrow Wilson became president of the United States. Wilson, you may not know, was a political theorist before he became a governor and before he became the president. And he was, in fact, one of the great defenders of the modern progressive state as against its classical liberal alternative. And I take the opposite position and try to go against the tide by being a defender of the classical liberal state against the modern progressive position that Wilson and others defended. The classical liberal position for these purposes has a couple of key elements, and I'm just going to mention them briefly and then show how this whole thing starts to play out. With respect to government, it doesn't want paralysis, but it sets its presumption against the wisdom of state action and therefore embraces doctrines of separation of powers and checks and balances and limited jurisdiction, all as a way of trying to make sure that the laws that do make it through are on average likely to create some kind of a social improvement. The progressive have exactly the opposite view. They believe that there's a class of individuals whom they regard as scientists and experts who are sufficiently dispassionate and separate from politics that we can entrust them with vast amounts of administrative discretion. And so far from thinking separation of powers as a virtue, they tend to think of it as a nuisance, and that a consolidated system of power in the hands of administrative experts who are scientifically trained is the solution to all of our problems. And I think in the end, my judgment on this is the so-called experts turn out to be politicians after all, and when the power they have gets put to particular uses, the last thing you see is dispassionate scientific inquiry. So that's one of the battles about the size of the state. The second of the battles has to do with the way in which you organize private arrangements. And if you're a classical liberal, what you're trying to do is to figure out how it is you create systems of taxation, systems of eminent domain, systems of regulation, systems of infrastructure construction and maintenance. And their function is pretty much designed to figure out how it is when you have a monopoly government, you can put a set of competitive institutions on top of it, such that you get the advantage of the state enforcement of the rules of the game, which requires a monopoly of force, and the advantage of the dynamism and competitive urge that takes place in markets that essentially have many people coming and going in apparently chaotic fashion in an effort to create some kind of a dynamic economy. So the classical liberal looks around, wants to have a small government then is willing to have businesses come and go, believes in effect that if you don't succeed and fail, bankruptcy is a sign of system health, even if it's a personal tragedy, and that the last thing that you want to do is to have large government entities create state monopolies which become impervious to the forces of change. The progressives, in fact, have exactly the opposite view on this subject. Hand in hand with the strong administrative state, they tend to favor various kinds of systems which will create either private monopolies or private cartels. They fear disorder. They tend to be very hostile to entry by new forces, and the reason they are is they know that new economic forces can upset the political domination of the institutions and organizations that they create. And what we've had in the United States now is about 3.5 major cycles over the last 100 years in which you can see first the progressives pushing hard with their particular agenda, making substantial headway, then the classical liberals coming back and undoing some but not all of the changes that they've introduced. And then before things settle down, you get another external tragedy and the cycle continues. So what we've had now are 3 cycles of progressive innovation and 3 modest cycles of classical liberal retrenchment. And we are now beginning in the United States the 4th of these cycles with the Obama initiatives in such areas as healthcare, the environment, and banking, and labor, and so on. The first of the cycles begins with Woodrow Wilson. And as I said, he became president after a stint as being governor in the state of New Jersey. His major achievement in New Jersey as governor was to impose a stringent set of regulations on the corporations, most of which had their headquarters in New Jersey, and the consequence thereof was that they all marched across the river into Delaware, where they had a more favorable regulatory climate, where they still remain. He might have learned from this that very excessive regulation leads to exit from the system, but he remained undeterred when he became president. I can't talk about all of the initiatives that took place in this period, but it is striking to mention at least one of them. And this was the Clayton Act of 1914, much of which was devoted to increasing the enforcement against monopolies, which sounds like a good thing. But the most conspicuous proceedings in many ways were Section 6 and Section 20 of the Clayton Act, which essentially exempted from the antitrust laws all agricultural organizations and all labor organizations, the net effect of which was to allow the formation of agricultural cartels free of federal interference and to allow the formation of labor unions with, again, real forms of market power free of this kind of interference as well. The effects of this was basically bad. The overwhelming understanding is that monopolies raise prices, reduce entry, and reduce overall consumer welfare. The antitrust laws, as a way to counter their power, is a perfectly sensible form of intervention in a kind of labor market. It was one, for example, that Adam Smith well understood when he talked about the difficulties associated with contracts in restraint of trade, that is, those contracts which tended towards monopoly. Now, the force of this was to some extent interrupted by World War I, which directed our attention overseas. And there's no question that when Calvin Coolidge became president, although he is much maligned, he was basically more a small government guy than a big government guy. And what happened is we had, with one exception, pretty much no new initiatives in these areas, which was designed to increase the power of the state. So it's not as though we undid what happened in the progressive era, it's we simply did not expand its scope. Herbert Hoover becomes president of the United States, and then Franklin Roosevelt. The conventional wisdom overseas is that these two people were really very different presidents, that Hoover was a Republican and that Roosevelt was a Democrat, and that the New Deal really began somewhere in 1933 when Roosevelt took over after Hoover had bollocksed everything up. Well, part of that sentence is indeed true. Hoover did bollocks up just about everything as president, and indeed as a fellow of the Hoover Institution, I'm always noting when I look at the monument that Herbert Hoover erected for himself, the one office that he does not put on the monument was president, because I think he knew that he made rather a mess of the entire operation at that point. And you can see it when you start looking at the various kinds of initiatives that took place before Roosevelt got into power. And you can see again the willingness to create monopoly-type institutions through one device after another. And let me just mention 3 of them to you, or 4 of them, to show you the way in which this works. One of them was, of course, that he was willing to sign the Smoot-Hawley tariff, which created very powerful tariff walls against imports from other countries and generated all sorts of retaliation by them to us, slowing world trade by about 50%, give or take. It isn't that he did this because he wasn't warned. In fact, one of the great University of Chicago economists at the time, a man named Paul Douglas, later a senator of the United States, organized a petition by about 200 plus economists who told him exactly what would happen. But Hoover listened to his business friends, and each business friend had a kind of partial equilibrium view of the world. He said, my industry will do just great if you keep those steel makers from overseas coming into this country. But the problem, of course, is if you keep the steel guys from coming in, it means all the people in the export markets are not going to have the kinds of equipment they need to compete effectively. And that's an error that's been repeated in the Obama administration when they passed the sort of Buy American statutes back in the early part of 2009, trying to give preferences to local trade. And indeed, one of the things that Obama has done, which I think will turn out to be quite terrible, is he announces to the world that he's in favor of American exports and he deplores American imports. It's not the kind of message that you could take, say, to the Czech Republic and let you believe that we become honest brokers when we have this peculiar one-sided situation. Free trade, in fact, helps everybody, and indeed, when you start putting the Smoot-Hawley tariffs on it, American businesses suffer terribly for a whole variety of reasons, some technical having to do with money flows, some obvious. I'm not going to dwell on it here. Just say it was a colossal mistake. Second mistake that Hoover made was he passed the Davis-Bacon statute. And this was an act which essentially said that when government projects take place, prevailing wages rather than competitive wages have to be used. That statute was passed in 1931. It's still on the books, and it raises the cost of government projects between 15 and 20% because essentially it's a strong pro-union statute. The third statute he passed was the Revenue Act of 1932, and this raised the maximum tax rate to about 63%, which meant in effect that the ability to accumulate capital for private investment was dashed, and this statute became basically a major impediment to the recovery in the New Deal once the Roosevelt people took over, which required stimulus as an offset to high taxation. And he passed the Norris-LaGuardia Act of 1932. Norris was a Republican progressive, LaGuardia was a Democratic populist, and the statute essentially said that the normal rules that prevent conspiratorial behaviors and restraint of trade by labor unions could not be stopped by injunctions. So that basically what happened is the program that started in the progressive era about freeing unions from the antitrust laws was carried 1 degree forward. When Roosevelt gets into power, he continues virtually all of the bad Hoover policies. Every one of the 4 statutes that I mentioned remains on the books. And he adds more. I can't begin to go into all of his policies because the man essentially had a new idea every day, most of them bad. But let me just mention 2 of them, which still remain, I think, as serious problems in the United States. One of them was he strengthened the Norris-LaGuardia Act by passing the National Labor Relations, or the Wagner Act of 1935, which essentially organized monopolistic unions to have collective bargaining rights in such a fashion that once the union was in place, the employer was under a duty to bargain with it in good faith, which meant in effect that those markets which were effectively unionized became monopolistic. In the short run, it looks very grand for unions and their workers to have this kind of power. And sure enough, by 1954, the size of American unions were about 37% of the total labor force, and the UAW, the United Auto Workers, was riding high. But in the long run, unionization is a death to the next generation of workers because the inefficient labor structure and the high wages essentially leads to the demise of these firms. General Motors goes from 500,000 workers in 1979 to 60,000 workers in 2009, and all the union guys say it's because somehow or other you've been unfair to us in enforcement. They do not understand, essentially, that you cannot sustain in a world of global competition that kind of monopoly power. And so the statutes that started to make things wine and roses for the workers of 1930 have ruined them for the workers of 1990, 2000, and 2010. And if you look at the towns in the Rust Belt that have been decimated, this is not a laughing matter. This is a very serious situation. The second mistake that they made during the New Deal was they strengthened the agricultural cartels. All the agricultural adjustment acts done in the New Deal period are still on the books. And these essentially require the government to pay farmers huge premiums over competitive wages. And they then take, or not wages, excuse me, over competitive prices. And then to take the glut that's created and often to sell it at bargain basis prices overseas, where you wreck the competitive structure of small, struggling economies because they can't compete with subsidized American farm goods with respect to their own domestic production. Those statutes, which were passed in 1937, are still on the books today. And American agriculture has massively improved its efficiency so the dislocations in America are real but not enormous, but the world dislocations, which are reflected in virtually every international trade agreement, are still very much with us. If there's one lesson you must learn about free trade, it's that the creation of government subsidies can do as much harm as the creation of government tariffs, and it turns out they're much more difficult to stop. And that was the second of the legacies that was created by Roosevelt. There were others. At the end of the Second World War, there was, of course, a reaction. The Republicans were basically troubled by this huge grant of administrative power, and in 1946 and 1947, they worked very hard to see if they could control the expanse of this power. And two statutes stand out at this point in time. And let me mention them to you, particularly for the students up above, who should know something about them. One of them is a general statute, was the Administrative Procedure Act of 1946-47. And the purpose of this act, as the Republicans conceived of it when they controlled Congress, was to reduce the arbitrary power of administrative agencies by requiring them to justify their factual findings by substantial evidence and removing from them the final authority to declare what the law was. If you think about this, the statute is an effort to cut back on the Wilsonian vision of the complete dominance of administrative agencies. And there is no doubt for a short period of time that it had that desirable effect. It did not get rid of the agencies. The Republicans could not repeal any of these substantive statutes, but it was designed to take back some of the power that these statutes had conferred upon these government experts. And the second statute, which was passed in 1947, is called the Taft-Hartley Act. And this was an effort to rein in some of the serious excesses that had existed under the Wagner Act. I have an old volume of the New York Times which contains the headlines from various states and various periods. And one of the things that strike you when you look at the 1946 period is on virtually every one of the pages they reproduce, there are three major labor strikes or dislocations that are about to bring large sectors of the economy down, basically to ruins, and the statute was an effort to try to counteract that. But again, it wasn't a repeal of the Wagner Act. It was, in effect, an effort to clip its wings. It did do some good, but it did not restore the situation to what it was in 1928-29, before the major reforms of the New Deal had been put into place. So the government itself still gets big. When we come to the Eisenhower Year, what happens is again a period of basic consolidation. Mr. Eisenhower was not a rebel, but he was not a big government guy either. And so his major program, interestingly enough, was the Highway Initiative of 1956 to build an interstate highway system in the United States, which is still in effect. It's that kind of classic better infrastructure program, but major social programs did not take place in the Eisenhower administration. And characteristically, the growth in the United States between 1946 and 1970, when basically the stable situation had prevailed, was in fact much higher than it had been in previous years. It's not that things were perfect, but essentially if you don't have to absorb major new social programs, private institutions get a chance to adapt to the regulations that are in place, and they've prospered, maybe not perfectly, but better than would otherwise be the situation. We then have major social dislocation in the United States again, and there's tragic periods in the early 1960s when, in fact, the attack on segregation in the South produced the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and there was the massive dislocation associated with the Vietnam War. And Lyndon Johnson takes over with strong Democratic majorities with a very powerful progressive agenda once again. And the thing to understand about the Civil Rights Act is that some of it was completely needed. Trying to figure out how to straighten out the voting system in the South was an important innovation which required federal intervention, which was far too overdue. But the effort to regulate labor markets under an anti-discrimination principle went far over the mark, and in the end, these statutes became massive intrusions in the way in which private businesses organized themselves, so that by 1965, say to 1975, the effects of the statute were generally positive because they undid segregation in the South. After 1975, nobody has been able to find any positive effect associated with the passage of the statute, and as a matter of theory, you can identify some profound negative effects associated with its operations, but it's impossible to remove these statutes. There was, under George Bush, a modest effort to try to tamp back on the Civil Rights Act of 1964, but at the same time, we continue to extend the anti-discrimination principle to new areas having to do with disability and with age chiefly, and these have turned out to be highly costly statutes to comply with, which have created serious dislocations in large numbers of markets. Universities in the United States are much the worse for the abolition of the mandatory retirement programs, which at one point allowed them to circulate through new faculty in an orderly fashion. There is a real danger that our universities become top-heavy with people who are too old to do their best work, and there's nothing that an employer can do except to buy them off. And in bad times, it turns out a lot of people aren't taking the money because they're afraid that after their buyout money is gone, their pensions will disappear. So you have that cycle coming in. It continues again under Richard Nixon, and he too turns out to be a big government don, so that in many cases the height of the Johnson period started around 1970 when he was out of office. You have the Environmental Protection Act, which became a case of classic overkill, the Endangered Species Act. You had pension protections introduced under a statute called ERISA. There are OSHA statutes come in with respect to occupational safety and so forth. The Medicare and Medicaid programs that were introduced by Johnson start to get much bigger in this particular period. So you now get another expansion of government, followed by a period of relative stagflation, such that I remember when we were looking for our home mortgage in 1980, Mr. Carter had managed to engineer an economy in which the short-term interest rates were 21% and the long-term interest rates were 16%. He lost the election that fall because those rates turned out to be utterly unsustainable and politically unacceptable. There was, of course, at this point, a retrenchment under Ronald Reagan. But again, one has to be very careful to realize what you mean by the word retrenchment. In technical terms, he changed the second derivative, he didn't change the first derivative. And what I mean by that statement is government continued to get larger under Reagan, but it got larger at a slower rate. And there were, for the most part, no major new initiatives that took place in this period which would expand the size of the government pie. This was a period where you had Margaret Thatcher in England, or Great Britain, and Reagan in the United States, and it was a period of relative prosperity, which existed in large part because stability had again returned. And in fact, there were some deregulatory motions that had taken place, in part due to Jimmy Carter, in part due to Reagan, of which the most notable in the United States was the abolition of the Civil Aeronautics Board in 1978, which meant that we got out of the business of setting rates for airlines and complicated inquiry, which created an immense amount of damages. Get to Bill Clinton. It turns out, if you put aside his personal peccadillos, he kind of understood what the situation was like and was benefited by having a Republican Congress, so he didn't do too much by way of new regulation. And things sort of went along just fine until the bubble burst because there were some problems. But that was in the internet sector, and it did not spread. When we get to George Bush, all of a sudden we now have, at least in the early years, the same problem you had with Herbert Hoover. You have a Republican who buys into a bigger government agenda than had previously existed. And sure enough, you get statutes like No Child Left Behind. You get the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, which is extensive in corporate regulation, which has had as its primary effect making it much more difficult for small corporations to go public, which means that the ability to get the next Google and Microsoft out there has been correspondingly damaged. And you have a new entitlement program under Medicare for prescription drugs, which is run better than most of these programs, but is an entitlement program nonetheless. And so now when you get to Obama, the question is, where do we stand? Well, most of you will remember that the world did not seem to be an entirely happy place in September of 2008, when everything seemed to come and crash around us. There is still a huge debate as to what it was that precipitated the major dislocation in financial markets, and I think the correct answer is a divided verdict. There is no doubt to my mind that when you looked at the private practices, two things were going on simultaneously. One of them is that firms which are in desperate situations will engage in traditional old-fashioned frauds. And it seems to be the case that Lehman Brothers used its collateral in rather promiscuous fashion and had in fact deceived the markets and the regulators by booking loans as though they were sale transactions. This may sound like technical nonsense to many of you, but in effect, if you make that transformation and you call something a sale that looks as though your leverage is down, if you call it a loan, which is what it was, then your leverage rates are high, and to the capital markets, leverage in effect gives you some sense as to stability in bad times. So this is not a small thing, it's a huge thing. And of course the SEC, ever at the ready, missed this one just the way it missed the Madoff situation, mainly because it has lost sight of its mission, which should be to prevent fraud, and has tried to introduce a regime of fairness into capital markets, which has done no good, and has done some badness by basically diverting it from its essential function. But there's also probably even a bigger role for government to play in this situation, because when Bush was president, you had a fairly liberal Democratic Congress, and they were pushing on all sorts of loans for private housing and so forth, which essentially turned out to be unsustainable. And not only did you have the Fannie Mae and the Freddie Mac money going in, but it became clear to everybody that even private lenders were protected by an implicit government guarantee. Now, what's the definition of a guarantor? The old Yiddish Jewish joke is a guarantor is a jackass with a fountain pen. And what that joke means, in effect, is if you are writing guarantees for other people, a guarantee is an invitation for them to engage in acts of misconduct. And the only way that you can stop it is to put conditions upon the way that they can use the capital they get from you so as to prevent them from playing the high-risk game. Heads I win, tails the guarantor takes all of the losses. They did not do that under any circumstances. And so when the whole thing collapsed, everything came back on the United States government. It was a desperate failure of central planning, and yet to this particular day, one tends to say that it was markets and greed that did it, when the important thing to understand is that the incentive structure was badly done. Now, this then gets us to Obama, and what has happened is he is now basically the fourth official progressive initiative in the United States in the last 100 years, and will, my prediction is, be the most catastrophic in terms of a failure if he succeeds. And this question is, as we speak, very much in doubt, because we don't know the fate of the healthcare. What we started with Wilson, went to Roosevelt, go to Johnson/Nixon, now you go to Bush a little bit and Obama, and he's pushing the envelope on virtually every element. What do I mean by that? Well, first of all, on international free trade, it is quite clear that he has an icy hostility towards it. There has been no movement to try to liberalize either bilateral arrangements with particular countries like Colombia, or to open up general markets by a general reduction in tariff. And the reason is he is very closely tied to unions, and unions essentially have been bitterly opposed to various relaxations on the import market. Leo Gerard, who heads the steelworkers, is the #1 complainant before the various kinds of tribunals in the United States designed to enforce what we call anti-dumping laws. That is, those laws which allow people to sell in the United States at quote-unquote too cheap a policy. So you have that element. Secondly, like Roosevelt and Hoover before him, but not like John Kennedy, who cut rates. He is a big progressive tax man, and it will turn out to be a futile policy. He wants to increase the capital gains rates by at least 50% over their current level. That will result in a reduction in revenues, given the fact that capital transactions are basically discretionary in terms of their realization, and if you have less realization, you have less efficient capital markets, they become thicker. That is, they don't in effect have liquidity associated with it. Pricing becomes less efficient. People's willingness to invest in the United States will diminish. All sorts of desperate things will happen. I can say from personal knowledge, he simply has never internalized the logic of classical economic thought. He was trained by a group of social activists. That's the way he believed. He may have some economic advisors who think otherwise, but they will never dent that particular preconception. His mind is, you can fiddle with tax situations and raise revenues without creating economic dislocations. That is a complete fantasy. And then the third thing, of course, is like Roosevelt, he's a stimulus guy. And he doesn't understand how stimulus programs work. And the first principle to understand about a stimulus program is, like everything else, it's subject to diminishing marginal returns. If you really believe that every dollar that's spent by the federal government generates 1.5 jobs and every dollar spent by private parties generates at most one job, then you want to have all your money in public hands. What happens is, as you get more and more dollars there, there's less and less sensible things that they can do. And in the end, the only way you will create jobs through a stimulus program is to count the jobs which are funded by government checks and to ignore all the jobs that were lost because of the tax revenues that were taken from the private sector in order to fund them. And this kind of accounting, direct benefits, yes, on the books, indirect benefit cost off the books, is very much a feature of this administration. How do we know, in fact, that he's wrong? Well, the unemployment rate is stubbornly close to 10%, and there it will remain until we start to liberalize these capital markets, and you cannot do that if, in fact, you're still going to create stimulus programs, which for the most part are wildly misdirected in terms of the assets that they produce and inefficiently spend, given the fact that it's a government that's spending. But he's committed to this and committed to their expansion. There will never be any improvement if, in fact, you have these kinds of programs. There's only one way to do this, and that's to go back to Adam Smith. You must have a stable regime. It must be one with general low taxes, and it must be one with very long time horizons. The last program passed by the Congress is, for this year, we'll give you a tax deduction if you meet 6 conditions and hire people in the next 6 months. Those programs just create stop-go economics. They're terrible to do. What you must have is long-term stable reform. There is nobody in either party at this particular point who seems to be really insistent upon that element. Now, the last feature about this system is perhaps the most famous in terms of its substantive program, because it implicates not only substantive issues, but clearly now brings into the fore the entire question of how it is that the system of separation of powers, the issue that I started with, operates in the United States. We are witnessing in the United States today an extraordinary drama over a health care bill, which has many incarnations. One passed by the Senate, which is quite different from one passed by the House. One which is worse than the other, and you can argue as to which of the two is the worst. This is actually something which I've studied, and I've tried to understand, and I can explain to you why I don't understand it, and I can explain to you in a way which explains why it is that if anybody else tells you that they understand it, they are not telling you the truth. There is no way to price this particular bill. Let me see if I can give to you what the problems with it are. The major problem that we have is it represents a vast expansion in the kinds of entitlements that we're prepared to give individuals, to the point where if we had money in their hands, they would never spend their own money in the same proportions that this health care bill gives them. So what happens is you add 31 million people to the rolls, and these are going to be extensive people to service because their health care needs often are greater than those of the middle and upper middle class population. Obama and the Democrats have never gotten it through their skulls that you cannot price the coverage that you give to new people by using the price experience that you have with established customers. You have to figure out whether or not the risk profiles are the same or different, and these are riskier and more costly individuals. In addition to that, the coverage that everybody has within current plans is going to be goosed up very substantially under this bill. There was an original impulse under the statute to say, if you like your current health care plan, you can keep it, but for a variety of reasons I won't bore you with, that is completely by the boards. Every existing health plan will now have to ratchet up the benefit structures that it gives, so it gives people more health care than they would rather have relative to any other group. So what you've done is you've created a vast new set of entitlements. Now you have to figure out how it is that you are going to pay for it. And there are only two sources of capital that you can have, or three sources. One is individuals can pay some of their own dollars for this, but if given the amount of the entitlements, with very large portions of the population, this is simply not sustainable. In fact, the subsidies continue up to about $88,000 for a family, which means you've got over 2/3 of the population in the subsidized class. That's a very big number. And then when you look at the way the subsidies are organized, what happens is you can't tell whether or not there's going to be any discipline. If in fact people with $30,000 are going to be subsidized for 80% of their health care expenses, it doesn't matter which is the first or the last dollar. They're going to spend too much money because somebody else is going to be paying for this. So you've got this real problem of over-expenditure on the one side. In addition to that, what happens is the companies, if they make an abnormally high rate of return, will be savage. And so the program also has a set of elaborate price control mechanisms, but we don't know how any of them work, because all we know is that they're there. We don't know whether the states or the federal government or the two combined can actually order a rollback of prices. It's just not clear from the legislation. And third, we don't know what any of the benefit packages look like, because their content is to be determined by the actions of delegated authorities further down the road. So you can't price the statute at all, because you have no idea what its particular provisions are going to contain. So looking at this thing, the administration has announced that there will be essentially a $1 trillion increase, which they claim will be covered by $1.1 trillion worth of taxes. So it's a deficit reduction measure. Well, forget it. What we know quite clearly is that the expenditures are far likely to go above that, and all of the efforts to reduce on the cost side are essentially quickly reversible. No one will be able to tell doctors who cannot make money under the current system they're going to take a 20% hit in revenue. At the same time, they're going to be subject to greater administrative demands on what they do. It is not viable. So this whole thing is now in equilibrium. If it passes, what will happen is as follows. The American credit rating will lose its dominant status. There are already discussions in the United States and in the capital markets that this is about to take place, because if you combine all of the expenditure programs and all the tax programs, it's quite clear that what we're introducing is a situation where we will probably have about somewhere between 20 and 35% of our expenditures unfunded by revenues that we can generate domestically, and we'll have to go to capital markets overseas to get it. And that means we're going to start to look like Argentina as a nation. Why is this happening? Well, let me see, and I will end on this note. I think I've gone about 45 minutes. What you have to do is to understand the mind of a progressive as opposed to a mind of a classical liberal. And I've had this debate so many different times that I'm almost pained to have to repeat the way the argument goes. So let's talk about Medicare, which is one of our large programs, which has always exceeded its projections in terms of the amount of money, precisely because the incentive structure is organized to make sure that every Medicare recipient pays zero marginal cost with respect to each unit that he consumes. This is a recipe for disaster in the aggregate, although it's a source of infinite comfort for an individual person when he pays it. And so when the debate comes up, I said, this is not a sustainable program. And the answer that comes back is always, we managed to sustain it such far. Stop being such a fussy fellow. Don't sound like Cassandra. What happens is the American economy is really very adroit, and these guys will be able to raise the revenue by their activities that we can then tax and spend in the way that we see fit. And you can do it once, and you can do it twice. You may be able to do it But sooner or later what happens is, as you go down the road, the additional benefits you get from the heavy taxes start to diminish, and the dislocations that happen with respect to its costs start to increase. And the Obama mistake, quite simply, is he assumed, look, we managed to introduce 3 of these programs and the country didn't fall to pieces, now I can introduce it. But he has gotten to the point where he has the lines of cost against him, and you are facing a situation of major systemic failure. This should not be a surprise to people in Europe. Many of the social democratic governments in this country have done the same thing. Spain is an absolute mess with respect to the way in which its labor markets operate. The Greece situation is perfectly evident. The British, after the discipline of Thatcher and to some extent Blair, have put themselves into major dislocations. The actual names of the programs will differ and so forth, but this is basically what the issue is. If, in fact, you decide to run a government as a way to create monopoly institutions, high taxation, and generous benefits, sooner or later you will run it into the ground. And at this point, it's sooner, not later. The classical liberal model was always one of trying to sustain a situation, and you try to use low taxes and limited governments to get competition working. And if you can get competition to work well, you expand the revenue base so that the amount of taxes you need to fund your essential government institution decreases as a fraction of the total money that you raise, which in turn improves the incentives for public production. That's the model in which I believe. That's the model which is not being followed. And so what's the relationship now, just to sum up, between politics on the one hand and the creation of an economy on the other? And for this, I think back to my late Uncle Albert, from whom I learned a great deal. And this is what he told me when I was about 15 years ago, basically over 50 years ago. He said, essentially, civilization is a race between 2 forces. One is there is technology that pushes you ahead and starts to create new wealth. And secondly, there are a series of governments who introduce actions in order to confiscate. And the question that you always have to face is, can you keep your productive capacities going fast enough to constantly offset the dangers that happen from rapacious government powers? And the answer to that question can be yes, if you curb the rapacity of governments by respecting the traditional rules on the importance of competition, the importance of low taxes, the importance of real prudence before passing new statutes. But the answer will be no, if in fact you manage to reverse yourself on all these things. And what we are facing now is a dreadly quartet of institutional ideas which can lead us to ruin. We believe basically in the United States in high tariff barriers in one form or another. We believe in high taxation with respect to the way in which we work. We believe in fostering domestic monopolies in agriculture, in labor, telecommunications now, and a lot of other areas. And we also believe in a regime of positive rights where everybody has a right to farm, a right to a job, a right to medical care, a right to a house, a right to this, and nobody bears any correlative duties. This is a toxic mix, and unless and until you can persuade yourself, as the liberale institution, as all of your other organizations believe, that that quartet is ruinous, and unless you can reverse that through political sentiment, you will face a serious problem that the United States of the 21st century will be the Argentina of the 20th century. And I do not want to live in Argentina, and I fear that will be the fate of my last days. So thank you for listening to my Jeremiah.
Děkuji profesoru Epsteinu za neskutečně nabitou přednášku, ze které jste asi získali pocit, že to, co jsem vám říkal předtím o jeho porozumění věcem z oblasti ekonomie, práva, politiky, současnosti, historie, jsem si nevymyslel a věřím, že kteří se k tomu odhodlali, za chvíli vystartujete a začnete si kupovat krásné nové knihy Právo, politika, ekonomie, které, a to jsem na počátku neuvedl, jsou takto hezky vyrobeny společností Wolters Kluwer Czech Republic, která je partnerem oné zmiňované řady Cevro Institute Academic Press. Nyní máme čas na vaše otázky, takže asistentky s mikrofony jsou připraveny. Prosím, ptejte se de facto na cokoliv.
So you depicted a cycle as if it was just a thing of personalities. One freaky progressive politician comes in, introduces all these reforms, then another less so freaky politician comes in to just kind of stop that a little bit, and then the cycle begins again. But I think you would admit that all these progressive reforms didn't come out of just the will of the individuals who were holding the office. I mean, they were really by and large respecting the will of the voters. Now, even all these Social Security, that's something that the voters really want. The same is probably going to be true with whatever healthcare bill is going to be passed in the future. So, what is there anything to stop this kind of legislation which does have adverse effects as long as people actually want it?
Look, I think the answer to that question has to do with the plural that you use when you describe that the people want it. There are two ways to think about the people. One of them is to think about them acting in unison, so as they all want this thing and they all get this thing. And if in fact you get unanimity, then it's a social improvement. But our political institutions operate by majority will. And in fact, what happens is you have a system in which some of the people want it desperately, other people oppose it mightily, and those who have the political initiative will impose it. So take the current healthcare reform in the United States. This is a bill which has more people who are opposed to it than in favor of it, by about 48 to 38%, with some untouched. What happens is, if it gets passed, there will be some winners who voted for it and some losers who voted against it. In a constitutional democracy which has weak property right protections, which is the situation in the United States, you can run powerful transfer programs through either regulation or taxation. And what you're seeing now is, in effect, the result of majority politics in a public choice universe, not the world of unanimous politics. Now, the reason why this happens everywhere in the world is that the political forces have always proved strong enough to overcome the constitutional barriers against general redistribution. And so in the United States, for a long period of time, we had a takings clause which actually had some teeth. But through the period of the early 20th century and the progressive reforms, the judges decided that no tax could ever be a taking, no matter how skewed the regulation. They decided that so long as you let a landowner stay on his property, it didn't matter if he couldn't charge anything to a tenant who he could not evict, and so on down the road. And the system of public choice essentially dictates the same result everywhere, which is you will have more redistribution through majority will than you would ever be able to get in a system of unanimous consent. And that's exactly what the problem is. And trying to get people to cut back on these institutions is in fact extremely difficult. The original American plan distinguished very sharply between a Republican set of institutions in which you had rich people with certain kinds of protections and poor people with certain limitations on what they could do through the franchise, and democracy, which was they regarded as mob rules through the ballot box. And that distinction has been completely lost. And so the transfer payments move. And the way you know it, I didn't mention it in the lecture, is the procedures that they will now go through to get this bill through essentially require that you violate both House rules for its passage and Senate rules for its passage, because they could not win under the standard situation. So you are witnessing, and this is, I think, the other part of the danger today, is not only is there, I think, a social program which is not sustainable, but there's also a set of procedural changes which, if it is allowed to work in this case, will mean that virtually every redistributive program, regardless of its merit, will have an easier job of passing than it did before. I'm in favor of 60 vote majorities in the Senate because I think supermajorities are an effective way of slowing people down. And if you get rid of those barriers, you'll have more of same, and in the end, what will happen is that fine American democracy will look more like Argentina. I'm not kidding. I think it's a very, very serious risk. Okay? That's the answer. Any other questions? Come on. What is this? You're such... Oh, in the back.
Mr. Epstein, how do you feel about the Federal Reserve's push for more regulation with regards to the Federal Reserve?
Or the Federal Reserve, more regulation.
And its roles?
Well, I think my first answer to the Federal Reserve is heal thyself. Figure out exactly the first party to regulate is your own policies with respect to monetary issues. And my view about it is that that was one of the major causes of the dislocation, was the consistent cheap money policy which the Fed introduced in order to fuel the housing boom. And the reason that it worked in this particular fashion is as follows. You only got the money if you buy the house. And if the money is being underpriced, you will bid up the price of houses until essentially you get to a competitive level for the combined practice. And right now the Fed is still running zero interest rates, which means that the rational lender from a bank will take the money out and turn out and buy treasury bills at 3%, will not put it into the market. And the reason is that the Fed and everybody else makes foreclosure virtually impossible to do in a prompt fashion. So there's just a terrible risk that if you lend it out into the standard credit markets, all the money will stay there because you can't reclaim it through effective devices. And one of the things that was terrible about the late years in the Bush administration, even worse in the Obama administration, is they are constantly wishing to postpone foreclosure. The moment they postpone foreclosure, they kill lending off at the opposite end. And the consumer operations that they're about to create in a separate agency, in fact, will have what they regard as consumer protections against foreclosures. The net effect will be to simply dampen the lending markets even further. There was an old maxim. When you had usury laws, the only people who could borrow money were risk-free borrowers. And you're going to have exactly the same issue. If you have tough foreclosure laws, the only people who will be able to borrow are those who have sufficient liquid assets on their own personal balance sheets that people are not worried about the foreclosure because they can chase after those assets. And so I fear all of these devices because I think in effect that what they're going to do is to make it appear as though the dominant risk that we had in the mortgage breakdown market was fraud by lenders on borrowers, when in fact the economics are the other way around. If the way I would explain it quite simply is if you borrow money with 2% down and the whole project goes belly up and you have to sell it for 50 cents on the dollar, what happens is the borrower basically paid rent and just walks away from the project, and the bank has lost half its capital. And so for you to sort of think of a bank that's lost half of its capital as the villain, and the poor individual who lost a month's payment as the party needing a protection, you've got everything completely backwards. And there's just no way that you can reverse this trending. Over and over again, the right understanding is when people put nothing down, think of them as renters, even if they call themselves owners, because they have no equity to keep them in place. And I don't think they understand that in the Fed, and I don't think they understand it pretty much in Washington generally. And I know the president doesn't understand this stuff because in his career prior to taking public office, he never once had to deal with complex financial institutions and arrangements. So they're just making blunder after blunder. It's like watching the amateur hour as everybody seems to rail against the banks under these circumstances when the risk is on the other side. And now when the banks won't lend, you rail at them again, right? Because now they're not lending. What you want to do is to get a series of stable practices, and the only way you can do that is to take all of the unrealized losses that sit with these unforeclosed homes, foreclose them out, put them into the market at current market prices, demand sensible margins, and allow those people who have cash to buy at half of what they would have bought in 2006. This effort to pretend that we're going to hold on to these properties until the market returns is the surest possible way to guarantee that that return will never happen. Okay, I mean, it's a bad, so they're not really up to speed on this stuff, in my judgment. Is there one more question before we go to drinks? Come on. What am I going to, oh, we do have one. Yes, sir. And what about you students up there?
Can I ask you about as you were talking about the mistakes in New Deal, I've heard a couple of times that if there were no deal, maybe the recovery of American economy could have been much faster, or the situation could have been better. So as I see some things that does the Obama and his government today, it may lead to some much longer crisis than it's now, because in the times of New Deal, it was maybe like 10 or 15 years until recovery of the economy. So I'm afraid that something similar could happen today. You know?
I think it's quite likely. Essentially, let me, for those of you who didn't quite get the question, I think I understood it, is there's no doubt that most recessions had relatively short periods before the snapback. And the New Deal, essentially, it started to recover a little about 1936. By 1937, it was in a tailspin again, and it only got out of it with the wartime spending. And so the question is, why did it take so long to recover? And I think the answer was all of the policies I was talking about, and particularly the high taxes, made it impossible to get private investment. You run public stimulus programs, they'll have some good, but essentially you'll never be able to get a government program that can start a new major business. Only private entrepreneurs can do that. So what you did is you had guys going out, taking pictures of people, the WA reporters, you had them building the occasional bridge. All of that stuff was fine, but they didn't found any company that would go from 0 to 100,000 employees in 5 years, which is what you really need to do it. What you have to do is to basically gamble that one of the 10 guys with a crazy idea actually knows what he's talking about, and he more than makes up for the 9 that don't. And we will have that position in the United States. This will be a very slow recovery if he puts into place his tax program for 2011. It will slow it up by 4 or 5 years in my judgment. But very much like the Japanese situation and so forth. The mighty may fall. If you go back and you look at all the great American companies of 1950 and ask which of them have survived and which of them are not, the illusion of immortality for large corporations is completely misguided. The illusion of immortality with respect to great nations is there. You can unravel much more rapidly than you think, and we seem to have lost sight of that fact in our collective deliberations. We're much too optimistic about our ability to generate growth under regulation. The Obama projections all call for 4% growth with increased taxes and increased regulation. I do not know what planet this man works on. I don't know what his advisors are thinking. It strikes me that if you can get 1 to 2% growth, which barely offsets population increase, you're doing very well under these circumstances. The prediction will be a decline in general income standards and living standards for it, because you won't be able to sustain anything given the current policies that we have. And I mean this in part, I think the Republicans are not as bad as the Democrats, but they certainly have done some mighty foolish things over their career. They do not seem to understand as well as they ought the importance of the sound principles on low taxation in particular and small government entitlements. They're in favor of a much bigger state than I am. Is there room for one more question? Can I coax one out of you? Or shall we just call it a day? And thank you.
Děkuji profesoru Epsteinovi, děkuji vám za účast, děkuji hlavnímu partneru skupině ČES, děkuji Friedrich Naumann Stiftung, Walter Kluwer Česká republika za krásnou knihu a zvu vás všechny na sklenku vína a samozřejmě máte možnost zde vpředu si zakoupit publikaci pana profesora a nechat si ji od něj podepsat. Věřím, že mnozí této příležitosti využijete. Děkuji, přeji hezký zbytek dne.